Hi, everyone. Hello. It's so good to see a full house on a Friday evening. So thank you all for being here. And welcome to the HUPA Chair for Urban Poor and the Law. Some of you were probably here in May when we inaugurated our first talk with Prabhat Chaudhary, and this is our second talk with Dr. Sneha Annavarapu. Dr. Annavarapu is an assistant professor of sociology at the National University of Singapore. She also holds a joint appointment as assistant professor of urban studies at Yale NUS College. Sneha is a sociologist by training, and her research interests include urbanization, governance, class relations, and gender in contemporary India. Today, she will be talking to us about a poster that some of you created. So thanks for that. Called The Uneven City, Potholes, Pain, and Politics in Hyderabad. Just like a quick aside, I met Sneha for the first time today, but I feel like I've forever known her because of her Twitter presence and her social media presence. What I really appreciate is serious academics who also take interest in meme making, Bollywood, and popular culture. And Sneha has all of that, and she has this amazing social media page called Masti Ki Gradshala. So I'm hoping some of that will pour into her talk today. It's so wonderful to have you here, Sneha. Thanks so much for coming in. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Anvesha and Sushmita, for making this happen. And thanks everyone again on a Friday evening being here. I really appreciate it. Um, and yeah, I do have an Instagram page called Masiki Gradshala. So if you're interested in how Bollywood and academic angst come together, so you can follow it and see for yourself what the graduate experience is really like. But today I'll be talking about my research in Hyderabad. And I'll be presenting some of my work on potholes in Hyderabad, India. I'm an ethnographer, so much of this is going to be ethnographic in nature. But yeah, I also want to say thank you for that amazing poster. I think it's very evocative and actually captured a lot of what I'm going to be talking about. So that's great. Yeah, so I'll get talking about my book project first. The reason I do this is that so there's some context to why I'm talking about potholes and it's not appearing out of nowhere. I'll talk a little bit about my data and methods because as an ethnographer, I think the most exciting part to me about my own work was actually just the fieldwork part, right? So just to give you a sense of who I spoke to and what that really entailed. Then we'll talk about potholes and I'll end with a short note on the significance of potholes and why we should even be thinking about potholes, and then we'll move to Q&A. So the title of my book project is On the Move, The Politics of Driving in Urban India. And it's an ethnographic book that sort of examines the structural, material, and infrastructural conditions of driving, right? Something that we do all the time, something that's such a regular, everyday sort of practice. But I examine, the material conditions of driving, but also the bureaucratic conditions of how you become a driver, how you're regulated as a driver. And I do all this in the southern Indian metropolis of Hyderabad. And my argument is that driving is not just about transportation and movement, actually. It's about state-citizen relations, it's about urban inequality, and it's about the frustrations and fantasies of a post-colonial nation such as India. And so the book is laid out in this way. In the first chapter, I tease out the chaos of driving as being a trope in urban India and what that actually tells us about the way world-class cities are imagined, right? Then I move to licenses and I look at how bribery and brokerage mediate people's relationship to driving and to the state. Then I look at potholes, which you will be hearing more about. Then to expressways and smooth roads, which is the antidote, I guess, to potholes. And finally, I look at traffic policing and how that's trying to adopt a different avatar in Hyderabad to make people follow traffic rules and to make that desirable a practice, right? So that's sort of the book. So now you know where this pothole chapter is really coming in. Um, so I spent about 5 years, not all of the 5 years, but I was splitting in and out of Hyderabad doing multi-sited ethnographic fieldwork in the city. I did a lot of observations and field notes, semi-structured interviews, participant observation, which meant that I myself learned to drive. And I didn't know how to drive before this project, actually. I'm still quite terrified of traffic, but I couldn't do a project on driving without learning how to drive. So the process of learning to drive was very much an important part of my fieldwork. And I also did a lot of interpretive analysis of news media, more contemporary than historical, but there's some stuff there as well. So spent time with traffic police, sort of tail them in their everyday duties, but also attended traffic training, and road safety campaigns and drunk driving counseling sessions. It was quite an interesting experience to spend so much time with such an under-researched, um, manifestation of state authorities such as traffic police. I interviewed and spent time and did ride-alongs with a lot of motorists, cab drivers, auto drivers, Uber, Ola drivers, as well as two-wheeler riders in the city and car owners. And I learned to drive at Elite Motor Driving School, and they didn't want confidentiality, so I guess it's fine. But that was a very informative experience. Then I spent time with local NGOs working on road safety. I did some volunteering at traffic signals and also participate in road safety campaigning activities just to get a flavor of how people are getting committed to the project of road safety in the city of Hyderabad. And then I analyzed news on social media that my interlocutors brought up to me. So I didn't do a big data analysis or a content analysis, but whatever tweets that people would forward to me, I would kind of track the comments on them and just had a more looser approach to analysis of news and social media. So yeah, now we get to potholes, and I'm going to go into my ethnographer mode and actually read from a script, but there's also slides to keep you entertained, hopefully. So Naganna's back is broken, Siraj casually remarked while wiping the windshield of his black and yellow auto rickshaw as it sat parked on a residential street. Naganna, 57 years old, was asleep on the side of the street next to the auto rickshaw. He looked exhausted and his face was wrinkled with pain. Alarmed, I asked Siraj, how did this happen? Siraj snapped back a tad irritated. What do you think? Driving. What else? After a momentary pause, he continued. They are digging the road for some electricity line near Care Hospital in Malakpet. There's a lot of loose gravel on the road. Plus, after last night's rains, the whole road is just full of potholes, very bumpy. Our man drove on that road, thud, 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 continuously, and now his back is hurting. The older we get, the less our bodies can handle these Hyderabadi roads. Naganna groaned in acknowledgement of Siraj's diagnosis of his lower back and of Hyderabad's road and slowly sat up. Siraj meanwhile got us some chai from a nearby tea shop and we both sipped it eagerly. Energized by his cup of chai, he offered to drop me at my destination in Malakpet. I realized that we would have to cross the stretch of road that had ruined his back, so I insisted, no, don't drive today. I'll take another auto. You take rest. Naganna waved his hands, dismissing my concern, and said, you think I can't drive on Hyderabad roads? I've been driving for longer than you have been alive. I could not help but laugh, and he continued, anyway, people like me are used to driving on all kinds of roads. We drive every day on all kinds of roads, especially old city roads. You are used to posh roads in Somajigura, Jubilee Hills, High-Tech City. One can even sleep on those roads. They are that smooth. In Naganna's candid comment about posh roads was a clear nod at my class status and a bitter acknowledgement of the fact that the quality of road surfaces and their regular maintenance and upkeep is not uniform. Poorer parts of the city are often marked by poorer roads. 20 minutes later, Naganna and I were bouncing up and down in his rickety auto rickshaw. The sensation of the unevenness of the road was amplified by the hollow skeleton of the rickshaw. The chiffon kurta I was wearing offered no traction against the slippery surface of the faux leather seat on which I sat, so I kept slipping off it. Naganna told me that it is while driving on this particular stretch that he broke his back. I felt my own lower back absorbing the shock of this bounciness. Almost instinctively, I imagined my vertebrae moaning and groaning with every bound. Naganna had meanwhile deftly hoisted his wiry body off the seat. He was almost comically crouched, his small back barely touching the seat. As I tried to hold on to the railing of the auto rickshaw, I told Naganna that I felt like my bones were rattling. What bones are left? I feel like my insides have become faluda, he joked, wielding his characteristically sharp wit. Soon after, in a tone that is best exemplified as resentful resignation, he said, rich people fly even on these roads. The cars that they drive in, they're so superior that you don't feel potholes or bumps. Motorcyclists, cyclists, as auto rickshaw drivers, we feel every bump on the road. I think we should make all the VIPs, PM, CM, MLA, MPs drive in auto rickshaws for one full day. The roads will become better, or at least they'll stop harassing us with challans. So recent scholarship on Indian roads explore the visions, aesthetics, and persuasions of modernity, progress, and world-classness that are more generally shaping infrastructural transformation in Indian cities. highlighting the exclusionary logics that undergird the building of expressways, elevated highways, flyovers, ring roads, and other attendant transit infrastructures. These interventions helpfully reveal the reproduction of class inequality through planning, elitism, and neoliberal urbanization in India. So, literatures like this often argue that Indian cities are undergoing infrastructural transformation that reproduces class inequality. So, and I don't disagree with that. And in fact, Hyderabad is no stranger to what Stephen Graham calls the fetishization of mega road projects, right? So projects like the Strategic Road Development Project in Hyderabad is a classic example of how Hyderabad is being turned into what a lot of my interlocutors have called flyover city, right? While the Nehru Outer Ring Road, an 8-lane expressway that hugs the city in a tight embrace, has become the emblem of Hyderabad's development and globality. So during my fieldwork, it was very common to hear that the city has become very developed, baga developed aindi, which often meant that the city has gone from being a sleepy and relaxed hallu capital to a bustling and busy, globally salient metropolis that has begun to rival its southern counterpart, Bengaluru, in its offering of multinational companies, global brands, shopping malls, gated communities, sky rises, and traffic, right? So at the same time, conversations like the one I had with Naganna saturate public discourse in the city. The city's emphasis on swanky expressways and smooth roads notwithstanding, the stubborn persistence of potholes presents a counter discourse, one that brings to the fore as the everyday experience of bumpiness. As I was told repeatedly during fieldwork, the public secret of driving in Hyderabad and arguably other Indian cities is a story of driving into and around potholes. A tongue-in-cheek reference to Greater Hyderabad Municipal Corporation as Greater Hyderabad Municipal Corporation indicates this popular sentiment. So the pervasiveness of potholes as an empirical experience brings up questions about its analytical potential. What can potholes tell us about urban life? So in this paper, I argue, and I will walk you through that argument through the talk, that far from being just physical interruptions on the surface of the road, potholes actually engender political subjectivity. Just as people move on and around potholes, potholes too move from occupying a banal and mundane presence in public discourse to becoming spectacular protagonists in the drama of urban life. Potholes, as I outline in this paper, are or become political terrains in three distinct ways. One, they generate, sustain, and institutionalize narratives of state corruption. Two, through their capacity to hurt, injure, and even kill certain motoring bodies, potholes enable an experience of inequality in the register of pain and risk. And three, potholes spawn citizen engagement and claims making. And this will all make sense in a little bit, right? But I show how and why the banal pothole becomes an aperture through which we view the desires, discomforts, and disappointments of life in Hyderabad, or more generally, urban India. Spines that opine. The road surfaces occupy an ambivalent position in public discourse in Hyderabad. On the one hand, the most interlocutors I spoke with praised the roads in the city, often characterizing them as being wide and smooth, right? On the other hand, roads in the city were also characterized as being bumpy, full of potholes and unauthorized speed breakers, in disrepair and prone to waterlogging. So while the former observations were more often made by drivers of cars, the latter observations were mostly made by two-wheeler riders and auto rickshaw drivers like Naganna, but these two narratives kind of exist alongside one another. But the more overarching observation that brings all motorists together is that while Hyderabad's main roads or major thoroughfares are generally well maintained, other than recurring issues during monsoons, it's the internal residential and neighborhood roads that are neglected all year round. As Bhargav, a university student in his 20s who rides a motorbike, told me in 2018, the thrill of our great city is that you never know what a turn might lead you to. 1 minute you are cruising on a flat, smooth road. The next minute you might be bouncing off your seat because there are so many potholes. Now, it seems rather obvious, of course, that unevenness of textures of roads is hardly particular to Hyderabad. Unevenness in road textures is true of all cities in the world and is a function of several factors, including, but not limited to, volume of traffic, topography, weather, availability of municipal funds, so on and so forth. As an engineer at the Greater Hyderabad Municipal Corporation, for instance, bluntly told me, the priority of the state is to make sure that main roads are better maintained due to the volume of traffic on them. The engineer approached the inconsistency of road surfaces as a technical issue and as an inevitability, right? But for Naganna, Siraj, and other auto rickshaw drivers, the unevenness of roads reflected the spatialization of political and economic power. Much like the observations Nagana made about roads in my part of the city in the opening vignette, according to Siraj, in Hyderabad, some roads are first-class roads and other roads are worse than village roads. If you notice, you will see that the best roads are the roads that important people use, roads where important people live. Then when VIPs from other parts of the country or from outside India come and visit, they only see our main roads and our VIP roads. Then everyone says, wow, wow, Hyderabad roads are very shandar. They don't know what regular people drive on every day. We who live in old city and nearby areas have just gotten used to potholes. Who cares about these areas? Like Siraj, many of my interlocutors pointed to how the best roads in the city were those located around residences and workplace of the political and economic elite in Hyderabad. Contrasted to the VIP roads, roads in especially old city were brought up as being in disrepair, right? So this sensuous knowledge was most evocatively captured in the newspaper articles about bone-rattling roads in old city that are in such a bad condition that, this journalist said, people cannot help but feel a lump in their throat before setting out into the city, right? So for my interlocutors who lived and drove around older parts of Hyderabad, southern and southern eastern especially, the unevenness of governance was quite simply felt in the unevenness of the roads, particularly since they experienced the roads via lightweight vehicles such as auto rickshaws and motorbikes. That roads in older and more economically marginalized parts of the city are in disrepair is also perhaps not that surprising. This is what one would expect to find considering what we know about how political and economic power is spatialized in cities all over the world. What was surprising to note, however, was that those who drove two-wheelers in hot real estate markets around the IT hub in the city did not feel like their roads were any better either. That roads in parts of the city that index the promise of world-classness were often indeed pockmarked and prone to flooding, and disrepair became a matter of discontent. For instance, Arvind, a businessman in his 30s and a rider of a motorcycle, pointed out to me, look at our shiny metro, look at our malls, look at our Deloitte office, look at our Microsoft office, all these big local companies, our posh gated communities. It all looks fancy on paper. But then as you go out on the roads, even in these supposedly high-tech areas and you drive, immediately you feel so frustrated with the traffic and the potholes. When your body feels those jerks of the uneven road, then you feel the hollowness of all this development, right? Whatever political party you elect, the corruptness of the entire system is here, right here in these potholes for everyone to see. For Arvind, the jerks of the road are not simply physical irritants while driving, but actively contribute to the assessment of urban governance. This is not to say that Arvind's critique is consolidated or constituted only through his experiences on the road. Hardly. The pervasiveness of corruption talk in India is very well documented by anthropologists and political scientists. However, it is the everyday sensory mundane engagement with driving in the city that reinforces this longer held suspicion of the state and becomes the site of narrating the everyday effects of corruption. A member of the urban middle class that is promised a smooth road quite literally feels the intimacy of betrayal in his bones. Similarly, according to Sujan, a 32-year-old techie who rides a motorcycle, every time one drives on the road, one is reminded of how corrupt the government is. Just drive. The feel of the road says it all. In fact, Sujan's invocation to just drive is an instructive one that gets at the heart of thinking about how dispositions towards the state are constituted and consolidated on the road. A point that anthropologist Amal Bishara makes in an article about driving in Israel-occupied West Bank as well. Furthermore, the bumpiness of the road actively and seasonally engenders narratives of spatialized inequality and state corruption in Hyderabad. Every monsoon, news media and social media are flooded with images of waterlogged and eroded streets. Images and videos of roads turning into rivers from across the city serve up visual evidence of infrastructural failure and its seasonality. And this erosion of roads, of course, shapes motoring dispositions. For example, in a satirical article on this issue, journalist Sarish Nanisetti writes, to drive like a perfect Hyderabadi, you have to be a scholarly motorist. You need the mindset of a class 7 student where the main trick involves memorizing the potholes, manholes, and their location. And after every monsoon, you're in class 8 students and you have to learn another set of potholes and manholes, right? So in likening driving in the city to being a student who memorizes the shifting locations of potholes and manholes, Nanisetti leverages not just the culturally intimate vexation around the unreliability of infrastructure, but also hints at how motorists are expected to adapt their bodily practices to adjust to roads that are eroded by rain, driving slower, braking more often, avoiding internal roads that get waterlogged, or even switching to public transport. Now, all of these micro adjustments amount to developing what anthropologist Doreen Lee calls an infrastructural aptitude, and were popularly understood as ways of taking individual responsibility in the face of an incompetent governance and become an embodied enactment of class inequality in the city. From this point of view, rains do not just constitute a logistical hassle in making movement in the city difficult, they also play a revelatory and clarifying role. Seasonally, they confirm the collective suspicion that the state is ineffective and corrupt. So a 2016 article in Deccan Chronicle, for instance, starts with the grim statement that potholes have become money spinners and unpacks the generally held consensus around why roads in Hyderabad get so easily damaged upon a bout of heavy rain. That the materials being used to fix roads are purposely of poor quality, so that there's a need to frequently fix roads, which becomes a steady source of income for contractors and by extension, corrupt state officials, right? So in their book, Corruption Plot, Malini Ranganathan, David Pike, and Sapna Doshi argue that corruption and its manifestations in public life come to inscribe themselves on specific spaces and sites. In this case, the pothole becomes that specific site that seasonally shapes and reinforces long-held dissatisfactions and disappointments, becoming the material and metonym of urban governance itself. As Brian Larkin observes in his work on roads in Lagos, every traffic jam, every pothole, every incomplete road becomes a means by which the state is brought to public attention. It sets in motion an everyday hermeneutics about why infrastructures fail, corruption, incompetence, ethnic favoritism, or any of the other litany of reasons commonly advanced to explain a contradiction that people feel so keenly. Perilous potholes. Now, while injuries, deaths, and crashes characterize the world of driving, the very concept of risk undergoes a shift when one centers the materiality of the road itself. It moves from being a risk of a crash or a fall to the mundane accumulation of jolts and jerks, particularly in the riders of motorbikes, cyclists, and auto rickshaws. The unevenness of the road creates an uneven geography of pain, vulnerability, and risk that is highly mediated by the vehicle one is driving or commuting on. So like Naganna, auto rickshaw drivers were already prone to backaches and spinal discomfort quite simply because of the amount of time they spent driving on a daily basis. But potholes certainly made the aches and pains more acutely and keenly felt. Despite potholes making driving more uncomfortable, lower and upper back and knee pain was not an exceptional experience for them at all. In fact, experiencing the city through the register of pain was so normalized that me asking about the pain was often a matter of surprise to them. At times, it was even implicitly brought up as an evidence of resilience and toughness. As Chakri, an auto rickshaw driver in his 40s, put it, being an auto rickshaw driver means being able to handle these potholes, these aches and pains. This job of auto driving is not for men who make a fuss about these things. So Chakri's candid appraisal of what auto rickshaw driving work and the kind of a man it necessitates, of course, explicitly excludes women. But what I want to highlight here is that his version of driving work implies an acceptance of pain and bodily discomfort on the job and on the road. Potholes, in that sense, also become sites of the performance of working class masculinity, perhaps a sensate disposition to infrastructural breakdown that normalizes pain and toughness as a mode of urban dwelling. Much as the body inhabits the city inhabits the body. But, anyway. But driver workers are not the only ones who experience the pain of potholes. In the past decade, there has been a growing concern in news media about potholes, about what potholes are doing to the teeming population of two-wheeler riders in the city that make up 80% of the vehicular population. So for instance, a 2017 newspaper article titled Spinal Injuries on the Rise, Bones Rattled on Battered City Roads reports how orthopedic surgeons are witnessing an alarming rise in back injuries amongst people in their 30s and 40s. And in these framings, these injuries are attributed directly to potholes. Similarly, a 2023 article in The Hindu not only brings up a causal link between uneven roads and spinal injury, but also offers tips to riders of motorcycles and scooters for how to manage one's posture such that the body can absorb these road shocks, right? So unlike with driver workers, this experience of pain is not normalized or folded into the performance of masculinity. It is framed as an important civic issue, and this is where the class lines begin to show around whose pain is framed as a civic issue. Is the pain of two-wheeler riders more so than driver workers, which comes up as an issue to be solved, right? So according to my interlocutors who belong in the techie world, it was not just that the potholes were causing them back injuries, but that they were exacerbating pre-existing conditions, which are actually caused by their highly sedentary desk jobs. So take the example of Nitin, a tech worker in his mid-40s, who commuted on a motorcycle for more than 2 hours to and from work, which also tells you something about urban sprawl. On our very first meeting in March 2019, Nitin showed up wearing a lumbar brace. Pointing to it, he chuckled slightly and said, Gayatri told me that you're doing research on Hyderabad roads. Well, I am a living example of the state of our roads. A few months before this conversation, Nitin had been diagnosed with a slip disc. According to his doctor, his pre-existing spinal issues, owing to his fairly inactive lifestyle, were being exacerbated by the long commute and more specifically by the bumpiness of the road. The doctor had apparently warned him of this problem a few years ago and told him to invest in a car as it would be better for his posture, but he preferred a bike to cut time spent in traffic, right? With his spinal pain become debilitating, however, Nitin took a car loan out and bought a Hyundai Creta, an SUV which he now drives to work every day. So buying an SUV for Nitin was not just a sign of upward mobility status and belonging to the new middle class. It was very much that, of course. The fact that he could buy a car says a lot, but also a way of coping with feeling the road less. And he did this very reluctantly. Now, while an auto rickshaw driver like Nagana and a white collar worker like Nitin have very little in common, their vehicles, their class and caste status, their occupational compulsions are, far apart. What they do share is a, shared experience of pain, injury, and discomfort caused or made worse by the road as mediated through their vehicles, an auto rickshaw and a bike, right? So, in other words, they are united by their vulnerability to the bumps on the road, unlike drivers of cars, particularly elite cars with better suspension. So potholes expose how, while in fact roads are for everyone, the experience of road surfaces is intensely contingent on the vehicle being driven, and in fact, extreme vulnerability to infrastructural failure is not distributed equally. Now, from time to time, potholes are also constructed as agents of death, particularly in the case of riders and commuters of two-wheelers. News articles about potholes deaths are rampant, and I'm sure you've seen some of them. And my field notes too are peppered with such narratives based on media coverage. A pillion rider falling off the back of a motorbike and into the path of an oncoming lorry after the scooter rider has lost balance upon driving over a pothole. A motorcyclist hitting the back of the bus, which brakes suddenly to avoid driving over a pothole. The rider of a scooter hitting a divider on the road while trying to swerve to avoid a pothole, and so on and so forth, right? So potholes in these media narratives around these accidents are framed as causing death. Infrastructure disrepair manifests in and by the bodies of victims. The Indian state too has begun accounting for the death and injury enabled by potholes. In 2017, the Minister of State in charge of roads and highways announced in the Indian Parliament that between 2015 and 17, more than 9,300 persons had died and 25,000 people had been injured in pothole-related road accidents in the country. The figures, disturbing as they were, also caught the attention of international media outlets. For instance, The Guardian published a story on this issue with a headline accusingly stating, "More deadly than terrorism. Potholes responsible for killing 10 people a day in India." More recently, it was reported that more than 5,000 persons all over the country have died due to potholes in an average of 2 years. Potholes, despite their astonishingly banal ubiquity in the city, become spectacular during specific incidents, particularly in news media. But fixing the blame on a pothole is actually not all that simple. From the perspective of police officials I spent time with, potholes alone seldom cause death, right? So my interlocutors in the traffic police department were often cognizant of how road engineering and infrastructure is an issue that causes unsafety on the road, yet according to Inspector Srinivas, who headed the engineering cell of the traffic police department, while potholes did cause accidents, deaths are often the result of motorists and pillion riders not wearing helmets, right? That's what he said. And from a traffic policing perspective, a helmet might reduce the severity of damage to the head, thereby mitigating the possibility of death. That's sort of their rationale. Police officials also claim that pothole accidents and deaths were often because of what they call rash driving, speeding, bad lighting, or a combination of all three. In one particular case during my field work, for instance, a young woman was sitting behind her brother on a moped and she fell off the vehicle, hit her head on the divider on the road and died in the hospital, right? So the rider, her brother, told the police that he was avoiding a pothole and so he swerved suddenly. She lost balance and fell off the bike. The police said that she should have been wearing a helmet. The rider insisted that the fall was caused by the pothole. The police insisted that the death was caused by her own negligence. So in this particular case, the resolution between these explanations was easier than in other cases because police had access to CCTV footage in a shop from a shop nearby, which they interpreted as being evidence of what they call rash driving, right? But the driver said in a television interview on a local news channel that the pothole was the reason that he even tried to overtake a car in the first place. The TV reporter conducting the interview too insisted, police say that helmets are the reason, but we citizens asked, why are there so many potholes that cause deaths in the first place? So potholes here become a springboard for pointing out the contradictions within the road safety discourse promoted by the state, especially regarding highly vulnerable road users like drivers of two-wheelers who are the most vulnerable road users other than pedestrians or on Indian roads. So going beyond charging the state with being corrupt and despite the ambivalences in the culpability of the pothole deaths have come to become a flashpoint in motorist relationship to the state. Potholes in this vein expose the moral double standards of the rhetoric around road safety. While the traffic police kept referring to themselves as caring agents of the state, most notably manifest in the hashtag We Care For You that they use in all digital communication, or they used to when I was doing fieldwork, the materiality and sensation and the consequences of the roads was interpreted as contradicting this very message. The literal ruptures on road surfaces were constructed as agents of death and injury and therefore became material evidence of the inherent contradictions and paradoxes within the road safety narrative that is aimed at disciplining drivers, right? So as Kumar, a citizen activist, also said, police say that people died because they weren't wearing helmets and the people don't value their own lives. The pothole was the reason they died, but instead, nicely, they blame the dead victim's risk-taking mentality. How will a helmet save me if I fall off my bike and come under the wheels of a bus, or if I break my spine? So this, again, is not particular to Hyderabad. Is one thing that I do want to mention. In fact, the first image that you can see is of my dad's friend who in Bangalore had a fracture after, ironically, he had complained to the municipal corporation about potholes on the street outside his house, but there was no action taken. And then he was riding one day and he lost control of his bike. And he appeared in the news as I was prepping for this talk at another place. And so I obviously had to put him in. But there are all these other maneuvers around potholes that do happen. The human rights panels were Mozo, potholes, peril, and Mumbai has been doing a lot more accounting for pothole-related deaths after a lot of activism in this area, which is what we'll actually move to now. So from body to body politics, right? So in theory, of course, citizens should be able to register their complaints about potholes with the Greater Hyderabad Municipal Corporation using either their phone helpline or the website, or more recently, their official app. In explaining to me how the app works, a GHMC engineer said that it was a way to enlist citizen support in fixing potholes faster. However, the predominant experience of my interlocutors was that the corporation was highly unresponsive and complaints seemed to, as an interlocutor put it, vanish into thin air once they are lodged. Another issue that came up was that different roads and at times different stretches of roads are governed by different state agencies, such as Hyderabad Metro Development Authority, Hyderabad Road Development Corporation Limited. And so figuring out who to report to seemed unnecessarily complicated to some of my interlocutors. So these ruptures in the supposed seamlessness that the app gives itself gave rise to alternate ways of hailing the state. So a well-known instantiation of a vexed citizenry taking matters in their own hands quite literally is that of Dr. Gangadhar Katnam, who is popularly known as road doctor in the city. Now, in his 70s, Dr. Katnam is a retired railway engineer who spent the past decade fixing potholes on the roads in the city using his own funds in his car that he has named the pothole ambulance. So he, along with a volunteer or his wife, travel around specific residential neighborhoods, filling up potholes with tar and cement wherever they're able to. In several interviews that he has given to both local, national, and international media, Katnam refers to his work as Shramdan or labor donation. The striking image of a senior citizen and a member of the, so-called moral middle class having to take up work of the state on his shoulders has become emblematic of a frustrated citizenry in Hyderabad. Similarly, in 2022, a group of citizens came together to not just repair potholes on the Miapur-Bachapalli road, but also float paper boats addressed to the state agency that had apparently been ignoring their complaints. Resolutely, the agenda of middle-class activism, citizens coming together to pool their labor and financial resources to fill up potholes had become more recurrent. In another instance, when Ivanka Trump was visiting Hyderabad, there were all these very, funny tweets also about how the city was beautified for her visit. But very interestingly, there was a group of citizens who fixed a road in a neighborhood in Secunderabad and named it KTR Ivanka Trump Road to kind of troll both troll KTR, who was the Minister of Urban Development at that point of time, kind of point out how ironic it is that certain roads were just completely beautified and certain roads were left in disrepair, right? So in these instances, people as infrastructure make possible infrastructures that work for them. As Emily Talon notes, do-it-yourself urbanism can be viewed as an attempt to skirt authority that signals the restive public not content for planners and architects to accomplish better living environments. The aches, pains, and discomforts of driving, coupled with the real potentiality of wounding, brings together an embodied engagement with the city via tinkering, fixing, and repair. So these campaigns also rely on the visibility and virality of news and social media to work. And this is not true just of Hyderabad, but of cities from all over India, right? So here you have from Hyderabad again, photography contest. You take a selfie with a pothole and send it to an email. And so it's funny ways of, again, trolling the state, right? Or in Bangalore, you have your artist who's been doing such interesting work using potholes as sites of artistic installations, right? And then you have in Kochi a wedding photo shoot that was done amidst potholes to kind of, again, draw attention to this civic issue. In Hyderabad, some residents also planted trees in potholes, which I believe has also happened in other parts of India. This was actually my favorite. So when the Motor Vehicle Amendment Act was passed and traffic fines were raised, this tweet went, or at least one of my interlocutors sent it to me saying, this is actually so true. We are ready, but what about you? With someone doing a yoga pose with a helmet on in a pothole, right? So by enabling the circulation of images and videos of potholes in their ubiquity, social media turns the everyday pothole into an event. The visuality of the pothole, building on prior embodied experiences that everybody has had with potholes, affectively and symbolically yokes together a body politic. At the same time, it's important to note that these innovative modes of engaging the state illustrate the creative potential of organizing around civic issues and the effectiveness of social media, but they also obscure its limits, right? So access to smartphones and to a social media sensibility is hardly universal, and subsequently potholes in certain parts of the city remain underrepresented in terms of their visibility to government agencies. The potential virality of a tweet or a social media post is also guided by algorithmic logics which are opaque. So these socio-economic and technological biases would imaginably actually further reproduce the socio-spatial unevenness in the city. So now I will come to the conclusion. So this paper reiterates the central theme of my book in explicating how driving and riding become key sites at which social inequality is experienced and interpreted through the materiality of the road mediated by the vehicle one is driving on. Centering the sneaky pothole rather than the swanky expressway or flyover allows us to see how the body is implicated in urban inequality. Riders of two-wheelers and auto rickshaws feel the city as hostile to its lethal and fatal bumps. An analytic focus on pains and aches allows a sensorial appraisal of how inequality, differentiation, and even belonging manifest in urban life. Which is why, as I've traced through this paper, these seemingly insignificant interruptions constitute political subjects, right? So the motorist's everyday habitus are engendered by persistent road shock has significant impact on how they orient themselves to urban infrastructures, plans, and futures, and that influences their politics in turn. The bumpiness of the road becomes this director key for urban life at large, with all of its socio-spatial unevenness. And for this framing, I would like to thank urban anthropologist Indivar Jonnalagadda, who's a fellow Hyderabad ethnographer, and he actually framed my talk in this way. I'm ever thankful, which is also to safely share your writing with other people. They sometimes frame it in better ways than you can, which is really helpful, but always, again, thanks them. Road surfaces become quite literally the terrain on which visions of modernity and mobility wrestle with the cacophony of everyday democratic practice, right? So I'll end with saying that taking tactility or sensation into account clarifies how inequality operates through urban infrastructure and how the sensuousness of the road is not just a backdrop to urban life, but an active agent that creates and sustains infrastructural dispositions in the city. A sensory approach, in fact, opens up possibilities to think about the counterpart of bumpiness, which is smoothness. What kinds of subjectivities do smooth roads produce? In one of my more informal conversations with an official at Greater Hyderabad Municipal Corporation, it was smooth roads that appeared as a real culprit behind spectacular road crashes. Smooth roads, this engineer insisted, were more fatal and lethal since drivers lost control of their own desire for speed. In a tone of familiar middle class paternalism, she said that it is the smoothest of roads that turn our drivers into risks on the road, since it is new and exciting to be driving on smooth and even roads. I was quite intrigued at her framing of drivers not as entirely free agents exercising a choice to disobey or obey speed limits. She, and as I would realize more of my interlocutors in the traffic police department, emphasized the surface of the road as actually being very complicit in producing a risky subjectivity on the road, right? So smooth road here did not feature just as an outcome of global aspirations alone. It also featured as an active agent contributing to the production of rule disobedient, pleasure seeking subjects that are risky and at risk. So either way, the pockmarked road of older Hyderabad or the buttery texture of the outer ring road both offer methodological and analytical opportunities for us to take a closer look at the surface of the road in all of its sensory, emotional, and political possibilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neha, for that wonderful and very sensorial talk. Do you have questions? Okay. Can you just come to the front and take the mic and maybe ask your question? You could also do that, yeah.
And potholes when you actually you looked into it from a spatial dimension. I agree with all of your findings. Just curious if you looked at it from an economic perspective.
So, like an economic perspective, as in the making of roads. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So some of this work around how and why roads come to be, not in Hyderabad, but say in Bangalore or Delhi, have been done by people who are interested in how roads are an outcome of political and economic ideologies, right? Especially neoliberal capitalism. My work looks or tries to push the conversation in the direction of, okay, so roads have been discussed as a product of specific ideologies. I'm more interested in finding out what do roads produce, right? So I don't look at the production of roads per se, but there is some work that, and I completely agree that I think it's a really important, obviously a very important story there, and actually tells us so much about why our cities are looking the way they are, right? And what kinds of elite aspirations and elite goals are shaping these, huge roads that are horrible for pedestrians and terrible to cross, and invoke also certain aesthetic of development and make that almost like a normalized thing for people to want, right? So yeah, I completely agree with that, but that's not something that I do. But thank you. And we've talked about this stuff before, so that's great too.
Can we collect a few questions and
Yeah,
then
sure.
we can take them together? So there are, can you come to the front and
Neha, very interesting talk. So I was interested in the question of culpability here, right? How are the respondents kind of assume the responsibility for potholes? And you explained it's a very variety of response. But even then, I think maybe legal battle will be a site to kind of explore it. And I was immediately reminded of the movie Enna Than Kesugodu in Malayalam, which is in English Sue Me, where the protagonist and a kind of engaged in a legal battle with the responsible minister on the question of pothole. It's a very interesting movie which kind of unravels many of the themes that we explore. So have you also explored certain legal battles that kind of pinpoint the question of, in otherwise an abstract state, right? So yeah.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to ask you for the name of the title of the movie again, and I'll have to watch it immediately tonight because that sounds incredibly fascinating. So some of, yeah, oh, sorry, yeah, look at this.
Yes. Hi, thank you for the lecture. I have a simple question. So you talked about how the everyday mundane experiences driving is produced. I just wanted to understand how does the category of caste intersect with class to sort of produce these mundane experiences of driving? Because I assume it's a very preliminary assumption that for a lot of categories, a lot of people, the very access to even these pothole-filled roads is a desire, it's a luxury. So just that question. Thank you.
Yeah, so I have a method question because you mentioned ethnography and simultaneously you were talking about sensory experience. So more like what I knew of was sensory experiences when we dive into it goes more into phenomenology. So bringing that phenomenology aspect within ethnography, how do you go about it in terms of methods? Yeah, that's it.
Thank you for the lecture.
Can I just like
So my question pertains to the fact that we have this Western hangover when it comes to development within our country. Most of our political leaders and in our historical journey, we had this Western hangover, and that is true for almost all the global South nations. So is there like this discussion was something that kind of shed light on how we kind of have to get rid of their Western hangover, but still what I couldn't figure out is there a way around getting rid of that Western hangover so that we can focus more on the development that pertains to within our specific regions rather than aligning our development with the Western hangover that political candidates usually like narrate their speech around.
Okay, I think fairly quick answers to them because the first one, right, on legal battles, I think that's such a great point. And it's something I've been thinking about developing myself. So when I was doing fieldwork, it's funny because I started thinking of potholes only after finishing much of my fieldwork. So when I was doing fieldwork in 18 and 19, I was so caught up in thinking about discourses around the regulation of driving, and much of my stuff was looking at traffic police, traffic police, traffic police. And then I went back home and I'm like going through all these interviews and looking at all these field notes, and people are talking about potholes and people are talking about bumpy rides. And I was like, wait, how did I just like miss this entire thing? Which also again speaks to what field notes can offer much later, right? When you take a look at it. And I did look, I mean, I was, when I was doing fieldwork again, those particular instances of these ambivalences around how do we assign blame kept coming up, right? But I haven't looked at legal cases as such. I'm not trained as a sociologist of law either, but something that I definitely want to look at. And Harris Solomon, a medical anthropologist, has written a couple of articles on potholes, and two of them do get into some of the legal complications on one accounting for pothole deaths, but also what happens to cases that people have filed against the state after a loved one has been swallowed by a hole, either a manhole or a pothole, right? So his book called Lifelines, Trauma and Traffic in Mumbai also deals with some of this stuff. But I think that's a great point. I do want to watch the film and delve into that angle a lot more, especially because I was coming at it more as an extension of the vulnerability and pain conversation. But I think you're right in pointing out that that's a whole space of scholarship on its own. And I think that's absolutely, yeah, thank you. The question of caste and the luxury of even pothole-ridden roads, yeah, absolutely. Like one of the things that I've often thought about is like, you know, what about like, okay, I get asked this a lot, right? I give a talk and people say, like, what about pedestrians, right? And it's something that has made me think about how it's not as if people are saying like they don't want or like roads are terrible and therefore they don't want to drive at all, right? Driving is still an aspirational practice. It is something that's caught up with a lot of status and mobility. For instance, when you buy a car or a bike, you become a bike owner or a car owner. But identifying as a pedestrian, as we were talking yesterday, is something that is yet to sort of become like, a cool category. Like I am a pedestrian and like, I walk, right? Or you have a lot of people saying I'm a car owner, I'm a bike owner, or I'm a cyclist of late, especially with the bourgeoisization of cycling as an urban practice. So, yeah, this is not to say that pothole roads are not an aspiration still, or owning a vehicle is not. It's still caught up in questions of social mobility, this sort of social mobility. Absolutely. So caste, class, any vector of social mobility is definitely a part of this conversation. It's just to say that a singular idea of automobility actually doesn't quite cut it. So when we think of driving in India, unfortunately, a lot of the literature looks at cars, right? But 80% of your road users are actually motorcyclists or cyclists. And to capture that experience means sort of getting into the weeds with stuff like this. So I'll say that. I don't know if it answers the question entirely, but this is what comes to mind. Phenomenology and method and ethnography. So with my ethnographic work, right, like I try to juxtapose it with newspapers, articles, with interviews, with all kinds of things. So while the field notes were deeply phenomenological in that sense of centering the body and like sensation and taking a more body up sort of approach, I find that in writing, it's helpful to also bring in other sources of data. So for me, what's been really helpful is newspaper articles that cover this. And unfortunately, I'm not as bilingual as I wish I were. So I focus more on English newspaper articles. But I think that's one way to maybe going about making the ethnography a bit more inclusive of other people's voices, experiences, narratives, while also not necessarily dispelling your own or going away from the sensorial and the phenomenological aspects of this. Yeah. Yeah. And the fourth one, Western hangover. So it's funny because Hyderabad has actually had a Singapore hangover for a long time. So in 1997, Chandrababu Naidu went to Singapore and came back and wanted to turn Hyderabad into Singapore. And so we had a Singapore city and a Malaysian township, residential complexes that came up on either side of the city. Malaysian township has done really well. Singapore city has been forgotten and now been renamed as Sanskriti township, actually. But so it's this sort of Asian urbanism that has been coming up in the past couple of decades, right? It was in a way trying to be a resistance to this Western hangover that we're talking about. So the aesthetics of Hyderabad city are actually modeled more aspirationally on Singapore or Mumbai or Shanghai, right? Like these kind of direct references made to Asian cities. But it's hard to, of course, pull them apart and say, well, that's not an American influence, or that's not Singaporean. All of this to say, I think the solution really is on radically decentralizing urban planning, right? Like to actually think about neighborhood communities and local entities. So being radically bottom-up approach towards what kind of city do you want to live in? And by you means everyone, a pedestrian, a cyclist, a biker, right? And at this point, car drivers, car owners are being privileged as the clientele to be serviced, even though they are a minuscule population in the overall picture, right? So the Western hangover that we're talking about, in a sense, has its Indianization and caste and class inequality that has been really, really long-standing in India. So it's not just a Western hangover, it's an Indian version of that we see. And to counter that would be radically participatory and radically democratized kind of planning, I would say. Yeah. That's it.
Okay. So I'd like to start with mine. I was thinking about the traffic policemen who are
also part of, this uneven city within areas probably with more potholes than usual here. And also ride probably more of two-wheelers and therefore possibly share this package at the same time. But also when we say an accident happens or somebody or somebody dies, then they also are the front of the state, right? They're also facing the public wrong on behalf of the state. So how, since you've done some work earlier, how do you think that comes in your work? What did you, if you could talk a little more, that would be great. And more questions. So, Ari.
I'm just curious about why you decided to do ethnography about safe driving. So, like, obviously, a lot of things, produce like socio-political inequality uh, can be seen in many things in planning. So, just why driving and why, and how did you come to potholes?
Hi. So I'm going to ask you a little bit about what you shared in the talk, which is the experience of doing the field work. Especially since you said in your response to the previous question that you didn't start doing this on potholes, right? You started talking about traffic, the traffic police and road safety. What was your experience of you as a researcher, PhD researcher, going up to somebody like Mr. Nagarna, the auto driver you went up, and saying, I'm doing a PhD project on road safety, right? So what was that interaction like? And secondly, in reflection to your response to Amartya, um, you are located in Singapore yourself. Did that come up in any of the interactions? And if so, how?
Yeah. So I think my question, a comment and a question both. So when you look at problems in Bangalore, there are a lot of parastatal agencies that function. So there's the BDA, there's BWSSB, there's BBMP. They all function together, and there was a very popular vignette where we focused upon how a road was dug up to lay a sewerage line, and then it was filled again, and then it was redug because there was a lack of coordination between the agencies. I'm not sure how much of that applies to Hyderabad, but in Bangalore, like this is something that is the root of a lot of problems. So I was just wondering, when you were doing like the study, did you also look at like the solutioning of such broader infrastructural and institutional problems that exist when it comes to urban planning? So I want to understand, you spoke about the body environment specifically, right? And on the road for women and people of, I would say generally marginalized population, being on the road is a sense of freedom, which kind of surpasses, what the road produces at the end of it. So in your sample size of who all you spoke to, did women or interlocutors of other genders have any comments on, that being something that they still would choose over potholes? So, yeah. Okay. Cool. So traffic police, thank you for asking. This was so working with traffic police, right? Like it was actually very difficult for me because on the one hand, like I was doing my PhD in the US, right? And rightly so, a lot of literature on police institutions being absolutely violent carceral systems, right? Of reproducing racial class inequality. Come to India, and I had read enough about policing organizations to know that there is a deeply hierarchical system at place, right? So I started doing work in Hyderabad, and I realized that there was the there is what anthropologists Beatrice Jaragbe call the subalternity within the police department itself. So you have home guards and constables who are also often belonging to to perhaps a social
context and background that renders them vulnerable to their superiors, right? So they are also in a context of an organizational hierarchy, as all organizations are. So what ended up happening with potholes was that traffic police themselves would often talk about potholes in the residential streets outside their house, and these conversations around the shared vulnerability of two-wheeler riders came up. But as an organization, the traffic police were actually using potholes in a very interesting way. What they were doing is that they had this Facebook page when I was doing field work in which they were putting up a lot of pictures or evidence of police being friendly police. So whenever there were potholes to be filled up, they would actually take some concrete and tar and fill them up and take pictures, like posing with the pothole that has been filled up, being like, GHMC has not done its job as well, so HTP to the rescue, right? So there are ways in which potholes are actually becoming sites of the performance of police friendliness in Hyderabad. And that's a very contentious issue because Telangana police is anything but friendly. It's been like carrying out a lot of really violent raids and, in the name of public safety, harassing low income and particularly Muslim residents in older parts of the city, right? But my point is that the framing of potholes is actually becoming a part of this friendly policing strategy was what came to mind as we were speaking about traffic police. Not quite their experiences with potholes as residents, but then what also came to mind was a lot of conversations I had with constables and homeguards about their felt vulnerability within the police hierarchy system, but I won't talk about that here. That's a separate chapter in the book itself. But yeah, so potholes did feature in a quite a surprising way as a way of, I guess, communicating that Hyderabad traffic police deeply cares for you as citizens, right? And when I was doing fieldwork is when an engineering cell was created, which was like supposed to be this coordinating agency between municipal corporation and Hyderabad traffic police, and it was manned by civil engineering proficient traffic police who were in charge of the system. But I don't think that worked out very well. I attended a few of their seminars, but there was some, again, lack of coordination between these different parasocial agencies, right? So police often felt like GHMC was not responding to them, and there were a lot of ego clashes in the midst and so on and so forth. But I'll stop there, but we can chat more about traffic police later. So why ethnography, driving and riding? I mean, yes, you're absolutely right. Social inequality exists in several sites and several ways and spaces. I started looking at driving partly because I was really thinking about how so much of the literature on automobility is on cars, but the predominant experience of traveling or riding in India is actually two-wheeler riders. And I was curious about how auto rickshaw drivers navigate these streets. What prompted me to think about driving and riding actually was when I almost got hit by an auto rickshaw driver, and we had this really heated altercation. And then I thought, oh wow, maybe I'll turn this into a sociological study and see what happens. Pretty much, I keep joking, it was a dissertation by accident, quite literally, but it took me to very interesting spaces, right? Because the question of like how do motorists understand risk, safety, pleasure, even how do they view their the state authority that is trying to regulate their behaviors? Like, these are questions that can be generalized to other behaviors as well. So one thing that kept coming up during my fieldwork was queuing. People would often point to queuing as something Indians don't do, and that being reflected in traffic. Right? So there are all these analogies that were also being brought up to other behaviors that have become, I guess, instantiations of India's, in quotes, unmodernity, so to speak, right? So there's a lot of anxiety around the aesthetics of what a developed city should look like. And this disorderly traffic wasn't quite cutting it. So in those ways, it kind of got built up. But yeah, it's in all sites and spaces. I think driving does provide an opportunity to think about an embodied experience of urban infrastructure in because you're sort of spending so much time on the road. It's a highly sensorial experience. So it does offer a way to kind of think about the body a little more robustly, I guess. But that is maybe me selling my project too hard. 7, fieldwork, potholes, traffic police, social, something more serious. Yes, the marginalized and the feeling of. Oh, right. So that is the question that I have. I think I've missed one question here, so I'm so sorry, but you can ask me again. Oh, yeah, ethnography and positionality. Yes, right, of course. Yeah, thank you for asking. It's something that I always talk about whenever I teach qualitative methods. But the first few months of doing fieldwork as a PhD student it was absolutely daunting. It was easier to get access to traffic police, and this reeks of my privilege, right, of caste and class privilege, of just being able to make a couple of calls and get some time with the Hyderabad police commissioner, and then being able to make those inroads into traffic. I write about that honestly as much as I can in my work. With drivers, it was very different, right? So with Uber drivers, what I started doing was just to kind of test out my interview guide and my approach. I would often take very long rides from one end of the city to another. And the first few times I did that, it was really scary. And I would show them my visiting card, and that really helped to have some kind of legitimacy. I had a visiting card made, which said I'm a PhD student at University of Chicago. That didn't mean much to people, honestly. If it were Harvard or Oxford, it probably would have meant more. But it was still fine. It was like the US, and so they were quite curious about me. So I would give them information about myself. Some people also did look me up on Twitter. I had a less intense Twitter account then. But there was a little bit, it took time, basically, is what I'm trying to say. That I did use other modes of getting in touch with driver workers like unions, right? So I wrote to union presidents and got in touch with drivers through them. So there was a lot of mediation through people. And some of it was just taking a stab at it. Many people didn't respond. There were lots of, missed interactions as well. And because I was a woman doing fieldwork, and this is where there is the underside to fieldwork, it was quite scary at times. My number was circulated amongst a lot of informants that I didn't know, so I would get there was some sexual harassment during fieldwork, and that there needs to be more conversation about risk to the ethnographer as well, especially when it is when there are sexual or other kinds of risks involved. So there was some of that. So it was a difficult experience overall. But yeah, these are the ways in which the dangers and the perils and the pleasures of fieldwork really worked out. And despite all of that, it was the most fun time of my doctoral experience, because it really gave you a sense of what people are thinking, and you got out there and actually talk to people. And it was nice to also be rejected from time to time, because you felt like you were doing something right. So Singapore and North Chicago, yeah, no, so I was not in Singapore when I was doing fieldwork for much of it. When I started going back to Hyderabad to do follow-up fieldwork, it was already with people that knew me. So I did some work on how the COVID-19 pandemic affected the livelihoods and the aspirations of cab drivers that I was speaking with. So they already knew me. So Singapore didn't quite come back to the picture as much. It was mostly the US, and like Hyderabad and US also have a relationship, right? So they were not quite surprised that I was coming back from the US from doing field work. People, US was always sort of there at the back of everyone's minds as a place that Telugu people end up at or something. So yeah, that's what I would say about Singapore and fieldwork, lack of coordination between agencies. Same story. I've heard endless laments about how there's just the breakdown of coordination, and Metro Rail was getting a lot of face time with political leaders at one particular point of time, right? So there was some resentment around that, like why HMRL is getting more attention or money or support actually from political leaders. There was an attempt to create a road safety authority, and I went to a few meetings, but that also didn't take off because of the lack of coordination between agencies or willingness of agencies to work together. So yeah, it was kind of falling apart at the seams in a very similar way. And finally, women and freedom. Thank you for asking that question. That's absolutely, yeah, it's great. And something that I teach a course called Gender in the City in Yale NUS. And I always tell my students that we do talk about the perils, the vulnerabilities and the risks, but that is not to say that being out in, even for me as a field worker and ethnographer, it was the most freeing experience actually, despite the fact that it was risky, despite the fact that I was being sexualized now and then. Despite all that, it was the best time of my life for that reason. Like being on the move is joyous in its own ways, right? Absolutely. So despite the bumpiness of the road and all of that, so many women, young women that I knew were so eager to get on mopeds and drive, bad roads, good roads, whatever, they just wanted to drive, right? And this also actually brings up a really important point that I didn't know how to grapple with, which is that in this talk of like making public transport a thing, right? What is missing is the recognition of the fact that for women, driving and actually being on mopeds and being car drivers is not just a class thing, it's a gender thing. It's like take back the city in a particular way, right? And that complicates the public. I mean, I don't mean to say anything against public transport advocates, least of all Ojas Shetty, but
No, but
yeah,
like women are also buying more SUVs for the same
right,
reason.
exactly.
Because, like,
Buying
car
SUVs,
makes them feel
yeah,
safer.
precisely. And this question of safety and pleasure were kind of sitting very closely next to each other during my fieldwork because even like cabs were feeling a bit unsafe, then the aspiration to drive was not just a compulsion one, but also brought them a lot of joy, right? So yeah, absolutely. I think it's all there. As social scientists, I think we tend to amplify one angle of the story a bit more to make it all fit into a journal article of some kind, and in some ways reduce the complexity of it. But thank you for that. That's absolutely right. Yeah.
So we are already over time, but we'll take two questions. So one is you and another person. Okay, we can correct, right?
I need to go because I think it'll be relevant to the class. So if I may just, is it on? Ah. So the central argument is how potholes kind of disproportionately affect people, right? So they're kind of a site of inequity, and they're a site of inequity within a relatively in proportionally marginal group of people, right? Drivers, riders, right? This even the statistic of 80% comes from motorized transport, right? It isn't, and motorized passenger transport. It isn't even considering goods. It isn't even, so in terms of the overall volume, it's lower. Like cars are even lower, right? And this inequality is interesting, but like if you look at the solution, it's even more unequal, right? In the sense that cities like Bombay and I think even Bangalore, right? You heard the word white topping. You know, every time white topping happens in the city, right? Right. And in Bombay, they've gone wild. They've gone like thousands of crores to kind of turn these roads into cement, right? And the problem with cement road is unlike asphalt road that the friction is different. They generate more heat, so they contribute to heat island effect. And unlike asphalt, the water can't go through, right? So there's no groundwater percolation. The water runoff is higher, which means flooding is higher. You've lined your stormwater drains also with concrete, right? So that infrastructure can't hold the water. So like, you know, flooding creates its own set of, you know, unequal sort of disproportionately affects population, and being on road in that way also is sort of different. So like I'm saying, it's fine that a pothole creates inequality, but like if the solution is work, right? And it like, then, you know, what becomes the site of inquiry on the road?
Yeah, and that would be a great journal article for you to work on in response to mine. But no, I mean, jokes apart, I think that, yeah, sure.
Right. So you talked about the middle class like political engagement with the issue of potholes, which, if I understood correctly, was more to do with like finding solutions, like more immediate solutions, and a certain kind of aesthetic of what a city should look like. I'm curious about more radical like imaginations of urban spaces and maybe some like unions or other kinds of spaces. Like what is that kind of engagement, not just in Hyderabad, but like beyond Hyderabad, like across India, say for instance, or South Asia.
Actually, they're both to do with solutions, so it's actually sort of thematically linked. Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think that the solutions to potholes, I wasn't in conversation around white topping in Hyderabad, right? The solutions that I was seeing were more of this sort of let's fill what we can and let's hold the state accountable through the pothole becoming this like salient civic issue, right? But I completely agree with you that I think the solutions that we're seeing in other cities are actually exacerbating other kinds of problems, right? Yeah. So I don't disagree with you, is my only answer. Just if it still has nothing to do with what I've said, it could be an addition or an incidental sort of extension of how we want to think about how all these problems or the problem of urban, life and living, and again, planning decisions are kind of made. Who makes these planning decisions and why are they making certain kinds of decisions? Whose comforts and needs are prioritized over others, right? But that's a broader conversation that I can't quite answer. But yeah, so all this to say, I agree with you, and I don't think it counteracts what is being said, but actually brings up interesting questions around then what is the solution. And like I was saying, even the speed, like smooth roads, right? Those themselves are being constructed as sources of risk by police officials themselves. Right? They were actually like, potholes are not the issue. It is outer ring road and expressways that are the issue. Exactly. But that was, and my point is that despite that being the official stance, the lament of driver workers and two-wheeler riders are similarly cannot be discounted as being unimportant. You know what I mean? Like, especially as an ethnographer, I feel a little uncomfortable with the hierarchy of value being created.
But I mean, it is middle class activism, right?
But
So I'm
driver
saying,
workers are not just middle class
for sure,
activists.
yeah.
Absolutely not. They're auto drivers that I was talking about as well.
Yeah.
So no, I mean, as I said, as an ethnographer who is instructed to empathize with such of the subjects that I was speaking to, I definitely feel uncomfortable with the hierarchy of value, but I agree that there are effects that could be inimical to the interests of safety at large, right? Yeah. And just one thing. Okay. Ellie, So I don't know about radical solutions. I did not come across big radical solutions. What I did come across during some conversations with other sociologists working on potholes is that potholes are a big deal in New Orleans, for instance, and in a very American way, there's a lot of merchandise that's created around potholes. New Orleans brands itself as a pothole city. And it's sort of very interestingly become a marker of New Orleans' unique identity as a city that's full of potholes, right? So this is not answering your question, but it just reminded me that there are ways in which people, I think, accommodate potholes in different parts of the world. But in terms of a radical solution, I think it still would come back to that decentralized sort of planning, much of which I did not quite get a sense of. But I guess Hyderabad Urban Lab maybe was doing some work on speaking with communities, participatory kind of planning. But like I didn't quite grasp anything that big around potholes. Like again, the thing is, potholes don't actually come up as an important political issue, right? Like when there are all these municipal elections or whatever, they don't actually feature in that big way, which is also why I missed them when I was doing field work initially, right? They're not the big issue. But they do come up consistently and they come up in these sneaky, like minor ways. But to me, that was what was interesting, right? Like what are these little interruptions of the road that keep coming up that are not spawning radical, there's no mobilization on potholes, there's these sporadic social media kinds of engagement, right? But there isn't some like big thing that's happening. Even auto unions, they were obviously and rightly more worried about wages, and they were worried about the meters, they were worried about rise of Ola and Uber and what that's doing to their labor in that way, right? But I was probing the road surfaces as being, engendering these sorts of things. So there was a little bit of perhaps not seeing that kind of radical big mobilization around potholes.
There's this interesting phenomenon of pothole warriors, right?
Right.
Like
Yeah.
and they're in
different
every
cities. Yeah.
city,
Yeah.
right? I don't know. Do you talk about that at any point in the book also?
So Katnam is a pothole warrior, right? And there are people like that in Mumbai as well. In fact, Mumbai pothole warrior is quite big, I believe.
Yeah. Bangalore has a guy called Badal. I don't know if you've seen.
Yeah, I
him.
looked up his stuff.
Oh, right.
Yeah, Badal was also featured on the slide. But yeah, so Mumbai also has a really big one. And Harris Solomon is the one other person I know who's written about potholes in India. And he also mentioned these pothole warriors very much so. Yeah. I'm definitely ready.
Thanks so much.
Thank
Neha.
you. Thanks everyone for
And thank you for coming. Just taking this opportunity to also let you guys know posters will be out soon, but we have another event happening on the 25th of July, and do come for that. But thanks so much for coming today and have a nice weekend.
Also, thanks to Vinod, who's not here, for all the tech support and everything. Yeah.